So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about GDP. So the idea of this chapter is this chapter marks our transition from just looking at all of economics as a discipline and specifically focusing on macroeconomics. So if you're taking the microeconomics course at the same time, you may have noticed that it was kind of overlapping each other. In this case, we're now deviating from that. Specifically, over these next two chapters, we're going to be looking at three economic statistics that macroeconomists focus their attention on. Let's see here. And so that would be where we try to measure production, where we try to measure prices, and where we try to measure unemployment. And I guess the best analogy I can give to this is just like if you go in for a physical, and you know that you're sick, you go into the doctor and you say, oh, I think I've got a cold. The doctor still will insist on checking your heartbeat, making you cough, taking your weight, that kind of stuff. And that's kind of what this is. This is the way that an economist basically, by capturing these statistics, this would be the way that an economist assesses how the economy is performing. And so to measure production, we're going to end up using a statistic known as GDP. To measure prices, we're going to use a statistic known as the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And to measure unemployment, we're going to look at the unemployment rate. And so in this chapter, again, we're just going to focus primarily on, we're going to focus only on production, how it's measured. And then we're also, 8.3 turns out to be a pretty important distinction that we need to draw between real GDP and nominal GDP. That will become important in this lecture, so don't think that it's unimportant. Okay, so I'm gonna let me just talk briefly. I don't want to talk specifically about the slide, but I kind of want to talk about what it's trying to motivate here. The idea before the Great Depression, which occurred in the 1930s. Before the Great Depression, a economic slowdown would occur roughly every 18 months to 2 years. And what economists started to really focus on in the 1910s and 1920s was what was causing these recessions. And they had lots of various theories. Some of them were really weird, like sunspots and things like that. And they formed, some rich people formed an organization known as the National Bureau of Economic Research, which was intended to try to figure out, what was causing these economic slowdowns. And these economic slowdowns have a name. They're called a recession. So when you hear the word recession, especially in the news, typically we mean that the GDP, which we still really haven't defined here, is falling. And it was up to the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, to kind of oversee this kind of dating of when a recession started. And then the Great Depression happened, which was a really significant decrease in GDP. Even though we weren't really technically measuring it yet, because we didn't really know how to. But and for those of you who like history, what interestingly happened, and none of this is on the exam, this is just me talking. What ended up happening is that when we entered World War II, quite a bit of time was spent on managing an economy to produce both consumer goods, which were needed, as well as war production goods. And by the 1940s, early to mid 1940s, it was realized that we needed a better way to account for how things were produced in the United States. Thus emerged the GDP statistic, the gross domestic product statistic. And it's pretty closely analyzed. If we wanted to look at where this occurs, this is all done through the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And if we go by, well, we can, I guess, you just even see it right here. So here we're getting this idea. Again, still haven't defined this yet, but just think of this as total production, some measure of total production. The total production in Q2 of 2024, so Q2 would be April, May, and June of 2024. That's the latest data that we have, that it increased 3% in that time period. So let's look at it here. And you do see this distinction again between real pretty quickly here, but we'll kind of not look at that right away. But what you're going to see here, well, you can kind of see it here, not very well, but what you kind of see here, even just in looking at these little categories here, is you see different basic industries where money would be spent in. And essentially all that we're doing in measuring GDP is we're measuring how much, at least on one level, how much is being spent. And by tracking those expenditures, we're able to see how much total production occurred in the economy by measuring how much is being spent. Okay, so back to the slides here. So again, this chapter signifies a difference now from the Econ 130, the microeconomics course, and the macroeconomics course. We're now entering the macroeconomics portion of this course, where the big topics are things such as the words inflation, unemployment, and economic growth. The kinds of things that you hear in the news when you watch the news and you hear economic terms being used. There would be people using the words GDP, CPI, and unemployment rate. Contained within this as well is this notion that the economy alternates, changes over time, and that one of these changes has to do with the business cycle. Sorry, I'm trying to find where my pen is here. Okay, so that we could imagine that if we were looking at this over time, and we were to look at this as GDP, gross domestic product, which again, still we have not defined, is that basically it moves in a wave function where there's a peak, there's a bottom, a period of decline, and a period of growth. That peak this being our trough, this being our contraction, which is leading into the recession, which again you've likely heard before in the news. And this period right here being the expansion. But what you can also see is that there's sort of a, if we were to take the average, that the average growth of the economy has an upward trajectory, right? And so that would be our economic growth rate. Over time. Inflation rate, I'm not sure why they're putting this already in this chapter. We'll look at that in the next chapter, so let's not worry about, well, maybe slightly later in this chapter, but let's just wait till we get there. Okay. So finally we get to our definition of GDP, gross domestic product. And what this is an incredibly important definition, so much so that the next few slides after this look at each kind of the major components of this definition. And so we're going to have to look at this market value notion, this final goods and services notion in the country and period of time. So it's the market value of the goods, final goods and services produced in the country during a period of time. And if we look at this, first with this idea of market value, is that if we're measuring production, we're not going to use units of the goods of of what's being produced, like one car, one, I guess they're saying here, one melon, one haircut, that kind of thing. Is that we take the market value, meaning that it has to be a good that's traded within the markets. So we're only looking at legal goods, because those would be the only ones where we have a formal market existing. And we'd only be looking at goods that are sold in a marketplace, so it can't be things that are done, for instance, in a household where things are unpaid. And essentially what you could imagine is that we could have a price and a quantity of the goods. And we could have one good and the second good. This incredibly simple example just to highlight kind of what's going on here. You could imagine in this two-good economy where there are two goods being produced, good one and good two, and here are the various prices and the various quantities of those goods, that we would have a total GDP of $56 here. Now, this is also part of this definition, is that we're only looking at final goods and services. Now, what that means is that, when we think of other goods that are produced that are really complex, such as a car, is that, or even a house, let's just do a house. When you buy a house and the house is built, what do those contractors do, right? The contractors go to, Home Depot, just like you or I would, to buy stuff. And they go and they buy lumber, they buy doors, they buy appliances, right? They load them into the truck and then they drive them to, the job site and they build your house. The problem that would emerge is if I asked Home Depot, okay, how many doors did you sell? How many of this did you sell? And that did you sell? They could tell them a number, but then when at the end of the year I actually bought the house, right, that value would be counted. And what you can see is that I would be, in this case here, I don't know if I want to call it a sin, but I would be committing the error, at least, of double counting. So what I need is a way to when I do this kind of survey of producers of how much they sold of various things, I need to have a way to ensure that producers are not overstating their production levels. And the example they give here as well is that, for instance, if I bought a house, that in that truck, that I wouldn't include the tire, since the tire, when I purchased the truck, the value of the tire was already in it. And as another part of this definition, that we're only looking at what's produced inside the country. So what that means is that I need to take into account that there exists both exports, which is what we sell to the rest of the world, and that there's also imports, what we buy from the rest of the world. So again, if I'm doing this approach where I ask how many doors did people purchase, I would want to, again, make sure that these are doors that aren't included in the value of a new house that's being bought, but that also that door was built in the United States. And if it's not, then I need to subtract that value. Right, because I spent the money, but I need to subtract it because it's something that was produced somewhere else in the world. So I'm not trying to, what this really highlights here is that I'm not trying to capture spending. What I'm trying to capture is production. And that the best way of capturing production, just given how our economy is organized, one of the best ways of capturing the levels of production is by measuring, is by using spending. But spending doesn't have exactly a one-to-one relationship with production. And so we need to kind of like add or subtract things. And this would just be another example. Double counting being one of them, and this other one being exports versus imports. And then as well, what we need to do is we need to know that this GDP that we're capturing is measured over a period of time, typically 1 year. And as well, that the GDP is only counting new goods and services, not used goods. So used goods, if I buy something on eBay, the only thing that's going to be counted as part of GDP would be the postage to send it out and maybe like the various transaction fees and whatnot. But not the, I don't know, vintage cassette tape I bought of Michael Jackson's greatest hits, because that would have been counted in the 80s when he made that greatest hits album. I actually don't know if there's a greatest hits album. I'd assume there is. Okay. So, production and income are one and the same. And the way that you know that that's the case is it goes back to the idea of the circular flow diagram. And the idea that anything that results in the production of something must also generate an income flow to somebody else. And based on that, we can start to see here these kinds of flows. I don't want to get into too much detail about this. I'm not that focused on circular flows here. So, but as just a simple example here, we can see that the households are being paid, let's say, for instance, wages by the company when they work, and then they use those wages to buy various goods and services in the economy. I'm just going to pause for a second. Okay, so what we can kind of see here then in the next few slides is that we basically complicate it a little bit more, because we have households, we have firms, but then we also have the government existing. Now, something that you will see here later in the slides is that we do make a distinction between government buying goods and services versus giving people money and then those people using that to buy goods and services. So, right, a key distinction to that would be, for instance, the government builds the university, right? Or the government pays me as an employee of the university because I'm a state of Hawaii employee. But that's different than the state of Hawaii giving me money to encourage me to have solar panels on top of my house or something like that, right? Because if they just give me money and they hope that I use it to buy solar panels, then what we're going to see in terms of the GDP is we're going to see it not when the government gives me money, but when I go out and I buy the panels. So here what we see is that the government pays households when it pays for wages, for instance, like mine, pays interest and whatnot. It collects taxes from households. And that from businesses, they also collect taxes and they buy different goods and services. And then again, we can complicate this more by adding the international sector, which we kind of already looked at these definitions of imports and exports. And then we can complicate it even one more step by adding in the financial sector, and where that financial sector basically provides the funding for the households, the government, and the firms to buy the goods and services that they need. Okay. So what that does is it gets us a pretty important equation. That very important equation being that y equals c plus I plus g plus nx, where y is income, but it's also production, because production and income are one and the same. C, we're going to see here, stands for consumption. We're going to look at each of these on the next few slides. I stands for investment. G standing for government purchases. That purchases part is really important. Again, it's only capturing what the government buys when it buys goods and services, not when it just gives people money, for instance, like Social Security or something like that. And then net exports are NX. And so, let's start with consumption. So for consumption, this would be households spending money on goods and services. Services are the biggest part of the consumption thing. For purchases of goods, the Bureau of Economic Analysis breaks it down into two types of goods that are purchased: non-durable goods and durable goods. Non-durable goods generally last less than 5 years. And durable goods are generally goods that last longer than 5 years. Automobiles, furniture. Not included in this, as it says right here, not included in this is the money I would use to buy a new house. We're going to see that that's actually in the next category, investment. So consumption, buying goods and services, this is done by households. Then in investment, we're looking at companies, firms buying buildings, machines, adding to their inventory. So inventory would be when a company builds more than they're selling and they store those goods to sell later. Those would be what are tracked in inventories. Investment, as the very bottom of the slide highlights, investment is not stocks and bonds. This is investment in a purely economic sense, where the company is buying the means of production. Again, factories, warehouses, machines that they then combine with workers to produce goods. And then we've got our government spending on goods and services. And for this government spending on goods and services, this would be, again, for instance, like workers for the government, the supplies that the worker uses to do their job, but then also government investments, like the government building a highway or building a building, or building, buying various cars, machinery for doing things. But again, bottom of the slide, does not include, again, the transfer payments. So when the government, for instance, when the government gives money for food stamps, how does that work? The government gives money to the household, and the household would then go out and buy the food with that card. Where is it going to be tracked? It's going to be tracked by the consumer buying the food, not by the government buying the food directly. Medicare, Medicaid, the government is basically paying for the health care, but they're not delivering the health care. But the only exception to this, for instance, would be like for the VA, Veterans Affairs, right? They have hospitals and doctors that they directly employ that would, service veterans as well as active duty. And then we have our net exports. Our net exports, again, would be exports minus imports. What we sell to the rest of the world minus what we buy from the rest of the world. And so when we look at this here, we can see that, at least as far as in 2022, that consumption was about close to 70% of the total economy. Investment, so here's our C, I and G together was about 40%, which would leave us with a little bit more than we need to, which would then be our net exports. This is a negative number, so that would mean that, in our case at least, that imports are greater than exports. It's not as bad as it used to be. We are exporting a lot of oil, and we're not importing as much oil as we used to. So these net exports are not that bad. For as much complaints as we make about people buying cheap Chinese goods, right? Like this is I'm not saying that. I'm saying that that's what people say. If you look at this, at least, we're also exporting quite a bit, such that the two almost equal out. Now, one of the things that we can kind of do here, instead of just capturing the total value of the thing produced, what we could do as an alternative would be that we could do what's called the value added approach, which basically takes all of the components that are used to build something and adds those things up. So the idea here is that what I could have done, where am I here? is that I could have seen a shirt on the LL Bean catalog website for $35, and that this would have been consumption for $35. Alternatively, what I could do is I could add up all the various things that went into that shirt. So this would be like the cotton, the textile mill, the shirt company making it, and then LL Bean marketing it and whatnot. And if you add all those things up, it should equal the same as the price of the good itself. So this would be two different ways of measuring the same thing. This would be useful because what this can capture, what this can really help us capture are the intermediate goods that are going on in the economy. GDP does not measure how well people are doing, what their well-being is. To be quite extreme about this, when bad things happen, GDP goes up. So, right, car accidents happen. Well, GDP goes up because you have to replace those cars, right? Crime causes GDP to go up, right? Because then people have to go to the hospital. So this is kind of a bad thing about GDP, is that it doesn't, even bad things cause GDP to go higher. War dramatically increases GDP because essentially war is the killing of people and the breaking of things, and usually those breaking of things get replaced with other things. And again, it doesn't also count for what's done within the household or what's done that could be illegal. People get really excited about this. It's about 10% of the economy, right? So this would be, at least when we had that time when marijuana was illegal in all places, for all purposes, then it was in the underground economy. Now it's kind of emerging above ground as it becomes, right, for medicinal purposes and whatnot. And so it's becoming, as it's becoming legal, it's becoming part of the GDP. And then again, we have the household production. I don't know about you, but I do quite a bit of things around the house. Take care of my kids, clean the floors. That's one of my big jobs. I'm not paid any money for that. Unless you're counting Snugglebucks, but Snugglebucks actually don't count for anything in our real economy. So when we measured the GDP, but also what's quite important is looking at how that's changing over time, what that growth rate is. As I said when I had that earlier slide here, right, we kind of look at how the trend line is it growing over time, and so that's what we can kind of do over here. And you can see this. I mean, essentially, when economists go out into the world trying to help economies grow, something I did. I spent a little over a year in Mongolia helping that country develop. A lot of it really just was efforts to formalize what was going on in the market. Increasing regulations, increasing the strength of the government, increasing the financial sector to basically allow that economy to grow. And that as the economy becomes more developed, what we generally see is that the size of the underground economy becomes smaller. The country of Georgia, Nigeria, right? These all have greater than 50% of their economy being, cash and handshakes. In the United States, in England, in Switzerland, you don't see that as often, and that's what we kind of see here. But what that also means is that while it's really easy to start a business in the informal sector, the fear of why you would not want to be entrepreneurial, for instance, in Bolivia, is that you don't have enough of an infrastructure to protect your intellectual property, to protect your assets. Like if you do really well, maybe maybe the state-owned company will just take over your business because they want to. When the economy becomes more developed, that becomes more difficult to do. And we've already talked about a few of these, but as well, when we look at the GDP per capita as a way to kind of generally talk about how the economy is performing. In the case of the U.S., we have a per capita GDP. I think it's about 35,000, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see here. This will give us kind of a, I want to look at a map of the world. This gives us an idea, right? That countries big like the US, we have a per capita GDP of about 81,000. That doesn't mean that the average person has $81,000. Obviously, that's not true because we've got a lot of really, really rich people. So per capita GDP, which just takes total GDP and divides by the population, isn't that accurate for us because it doesn't tell us a great deal about how it's distributed. So GDP per capita would be total GDP divided by the population, which in our case we have about 330 million people. And we have a GDP of about $30 trillion. So right, if we do that kind of division, we'll at least get something close to, it's a little bit greater than that 80,000 per capita, but they might be using slightly different numbers for population and GDP. This is just kind of a rough number here. Okay. Now, just one important distinction that we need to make is between real and nominal GDP. And what this does is it provides us a distinction between, when I did this, let's go back to this. Well, actually, let's just do a new one here. So let's say year one, and let's say year two. We're going to have goods A, B, and C. We're going to have a price for those goods and a quantity of those goods. A price for those goods and a quantity of those goods. Okay, so now if I wanted to know the GDP in year one, I'd be doing the market value of good A, of good B, and of good C, which would essentially just be 1 times 10 plus 5 times 100 plus 6 times 500, which would give me 3,510 for year one. And that in year two, it would be equal to 3 times 15 plus 5 times 125 plus 2 times 600. Should give me 1,200. We're getting lazy. Okay. So look at what we're seeing here. I made kind of a extreme situation where I actually have the GDP going down. But you kind of see at least the steps here of what I followed. It took the price times the quantity for each good. The problem that we would have here, is that we wouldn't know whether the P changing caused the GDP to change, the Q changing caused the GDP to change, or both changing caused the GDP to change. And that's really what we see here. Look at that. The biggest change, what caused this decrease, was that for good C, the price fell by 2/3. Right? And if the price hadn't fallen so much, the quantity, the GDP wouldn't have fallen so much, right? So if someone said to you, oh, GDP was 3510 in year 1 and 1870 in year 2, people would be like, oh my God, we're producing so much less. And they'd be like, no. In fact, look, year 2, we're producing more of everything compared to year 1. So that's why it's important to take into account real GDP. So, in nominal GDP, where's my pen here? Here I am, sorry. In nominal GDP, I'm just taking price times quantity. But in real GDP, I'm taking the quantity and I'm using what's called a base year price. And it doesn't matter what you say your base year is going to be, but what happens is that then you use that same price year after year after year. You can see here, where's my pen at? Okay. Oh, here I am, sorry. Here we kind of see this kind of brief discussion here that it is in some sense arbitrary. Most of the time what's being used now is the year 2017. It doesn't matter what year you use, but the problem is that then you have to use that same year throughout. And that's what we see here in this example. If they want to use 2017 prices, right? So if we say that, let's do it here so that we can all see it. Real GDP in the year 2017 would be my price in 2017 times my quantities in 2017. So that would mean that I would have 80 times 40 plus 90 times 11 plus 15 times 90. Okay. And that real GDP for year 2025 would now be 2017 prices and 2025 quantities. So now it would be 100 times 40 plus 80 times 11. And then 20 times 90. And that's going to get me 5888. And what we get from this is that whereas nominal GDP changes as Q changes, as P changes, real GDP only changes as quantity changes. Looking at this and I'm trying to ask myself, why are my numbers different? How did they get 6680 and I got 5888? 100 times 40, 80 times 11, 20 times 90. 100 times 40. Oh, sorry. Yeah, 6680. Sorry, that's I typed it in the calculator wrong. Okay, well, I'm just going to end up erasing. Anyway, this 6680 is correct. Let's leave it at that. Okay. And what we see here is that once you pick your base year, the nominal GDP and the real GDP will be the same number in that year. And that generally done speaking, what we would expect is that real GDP will be greater than nominal GDP in years before the base year, and that nominal GDP will be greater than real GDP in years after the base year. I'm just gonna go around this COVID thing. But what it also generates for us, this idea that we have now this difference between the nominal GDP and the real GDP, it gets us this GDP deflator. And what we can do is that we can measure the change in prices in the overall economy by calculating the GDP deflator and then taking the percentage change in the GDP deflator over time. So what that would mean is, again, that you would need to take, for any given year, you would have a nominal GDP number and a real GDP number. You would divide those, multiply by 100, and get a GDP deflator index number, essentially. And then you would just find the percentage change in those index numbers. And you kind of see a very basic example here, that if I gave you nominal and real GDP numbers, that you could take the ratio of these, multiply by 100, and get an index number, essentially. And that then I would find the percentage difference between these two numbers. I don't know, the classic way to find percentage changes would be new minus old over old times 100. But dude, there's even like, Google will tell you what percentage changes are. I don't care what you use. In this course, any of those things are permissible. There's some other measures of production. The gross national product, national income. I don't really want you to worry about these too much. They're certainly not going to be on the exam. The homework, the system might generate some questions for you based on it, but I'm already telling you that there's not going to be any exam questions about it. And as you can see, they're not that different from each other, at least in terms of GDP versus GNP. Okay, that's it. Okay.